Us. Um, uh, this is the second time we're running this conversation today. I'm Jenny Hodgson. I'm Executive Director of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And we have Marija, who is going to be presenting the highlights of the report. And then we've got 4 people who are going to offer some short contributions reflecting on the report. And then we'd like to open it up to a broader conversation. We have simultaneous translation on this call as well. So when Carmen and Florencia speak, I think you're going to speak in Spanish. So if you want to switch over to the English channel for those who are English speakers, and we will advise people of the translation as others join the call as well. So maybe we can get started. I hope you've seen this very beautiful looking document, the 2 versions of it, the shorter one and the longer 143-page document that Marija has produced. I just wanted to say a little bit about where this piece of work came from. Since we've existed as the Global Fund for Community Foundations, we have always sought to include different forms of local funds and foundations, local grant makers, those who are building local resources. And so amongst our earliest grantee partners were organizations like FASOL in Mexico, and Carmen is joining us from there today, which is a socio-environmental fund. We've worked with many women's funds, as well as as organizations that work on a place-based approach, so community foundations working in a particular geography. And I think we have always seen the power of linking conversations between different parts of this ecosystem of a more bottom-up kind of equity, dignity, rights-based philanthropy, and have seen community as something that we define as place, as issue, as identity, that we can live in multiple spaces and multiple communities. And yet we could sort of see also that sometimes these conversations around community philanthropy and feminist philanthropy and women's philanthropy were happening parallel to each other without much connection. So back in 2020, which feels like a very long time ago now, we reached out to Marija, who we'd known from her time at the Reconstruction Fund for Women in Serbia, to ask her if she might be interested in exploring a piece of work to understand what was the same, what was the difference, what were some features of these different kinds of quite young and emergent practices around this larger field of philanthropy. And so Marija embarked on what was originally quite a small piece of work, but as she dug deeper, became quite an extensive piece of work. And so we have this wonderful resource, which is the 143-page document, which I think, you've done such a great job, Marija, of really bringing in ideas around, from academia and theoretical concepts, as well as rooting this in practice. And we know that in our work, often you're either doing it or you're studying it, but actually that intersection between practice and academia and theory is often quite weak. Excuse me. So we came at this piece of work with a curiosity and a belief that we could start to kind of widen the circles and widen the conversations around this work. And I think today, as we are meeting, we can see that, the world is in a bit of trouble right now. We have a climate crisis. We have an ongoing tides of populist authoritarianism clamping down on human rights, pushback on women's rights. And so it seems even more important than ever that we should be having conversations around how those of us working in these spaces might be thinking about flexing our kind of collective voice and muscle and what that might look like. So although it took a little while for us to get this report finally produced, because everything that could have happened, we're really pleased that we got it to now. And we held a meeting this morning with the other side of the world and started to kick off a conversation around, reflecting on the report, but also what it might mean for us in terms of our thinking and actions moving forward. So at this point, I want to hand over to Marija to say a little bit about the process and some of the findings. And then we'll hear from our 4 discussants, and then we'll open it up for us all to engage in a conversation. Marija, over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everybody. It's really nice to be in space with you, with some of you again, and some of you for the first time, which speaks a lot about expanding this conversation, which is one of its original goals. So, yeah, as Jenny mentioned, we started this process in 2020, and it felt a bit weird, like, okay, it's been some time since it was produced, then it was designed, that so many things happen in between. Some people keep moving within these ecosystems. So how then we approach it? But then as we were figuring out this morning, apparently there are some cosmic things enabling us to come in certain spaces when there is time. And our previous conversation showed that it is timely to have it now. We might not have this type of conversation like 2 years ago or whatever. So let's trust the universe. Who knows why it's okay that we are now all together in this virtual room. So we started from the assumption that all these 3 concepts, I'm referring to community philanthropy, women's philanthropy, and feminist philanthropy, are rooted in similar values, similar goals. They have mutually relevant practices, even though they might be different, but they can complement each other, and that there are also shared challenges. So it gives us like a good starting point to figure out, okay, how we are actually relevant for each other and how we might work for each other and why we should and should we work together. So it was like some grounding question as well. And the process started with drafting some sort of outline with Global Fund for Community Foundations board members, few of them, coming from very different movements, but again, interconnected movements and interconnected professional backgrounds. So we tried to figure out what are like dimensions that we want to explore here. And to be honest, from the beginning, even though we were hoping to have more digestible and smaller piece, from the beginning there were a lot of dimensions. So one would be like figuring out what are our conceptual things that we need to clarify, but then how we make knowledge, how we produce knowledge, how we go beyond what is currently known as smell, or transform it in a way that is meaningful for the people. How we are embedded in different systems of oppression within which we all function and maybe even reproduce some harmful mechanisms. So there are different levels of exploring things. So it could be said that we were looking into systemic level, then at the level of the movements, level of institution, but then level of our interpersonal relationships. And all that showed up in conversations with our interviewees, who came again from very different backgrounds all across the globe, quite diverse forms of organizing. And in a way, it was not just exchange of information and impressions and knowledge, but it was also kind of healing conversation. And it was very needed back then during pandemic, because so many things have piled up within our movements and our organizations, and people felt the need to communicate it and bring it into the space. So when we're talking about methods, it was combination of desk research and semi-structured interviews. And desk research was meant to connect both academic theory and knowledge that has been generated within the movements and within the communities. And those show up in quite different formats and not necessarily speak to each other, or speak in a way that is quite traditional and sometimes rigid. So we try to like figure out, okay, how to connect the dots among all these different pieces and make them like to see if they like support each other or conflict each other or what is the case there. So we had a very different type of resources that have been used, and it became a quite extensive process. And it is important to mention that particularly this literature review part was also open for interviewees to suggest their pieces. It could be either pieces that they have been producing in their work or something that is relevant and they feel it is usually neglected, but is important for people to have it as a reference point. So there was a lot of different types of community contribution in that sense as well. And then it kept rolling. So I would say that from this distance, there are several values of this process. First is connecting people to talk. And for me, it was very interesting that one interview said that she could not recall other conversations linking feminist philanthropy and community philanthropy, which for me, for example, was a surprise because in my professional activist work, I've been combining both, but it apparently what one person or one practitioner is seeing, thinking, using is not necessarily how other people are functioning or interpreting their field. So it was very interesting like to compare our experiences. And many people said that such conversation, like not having this type of conversation actually prevent people from coming together. Because when we talk with each other, then we can also strategize, overcome isolation. And this is something that we also try to achieve with this conversation, and hopefully it will not be the last one. Second value, I would say, is recognizing each other in a sense that we are here leading struggles that are quite complementary. And I think it is extremely important to step out of the scarcity mentality and competition in which we were all pushed because the system is simply designed that way. And this is like a good opportunity to figure out how we can actually amplify each other and support each other. And finally, what we started really to deeply discuss in the morning is to engage with ambivalences of our own positionalities and to engage with things that might not feel great in the work we do, that we want to do differently, that we might not even don't know how to approach it and stuff like that. So I assume there might be more values, but these are like 3 points that I found very, very relevant. And I think it is also important to say that lens that we have been using here is focused on women human rights as part of indivisible human rights. So stepping out of silos and kind of like trying to repair this historical harm that was made primarily during Cold War era, when human rights were artificially divided among different blocks. So our approach was like systemic to look on all these levels that I have mentioned, but bearing in mind that when we talk about women, it does not come from some essentialistic point, but rather understanding women in all their diversity and approaching from the perspective of rights. I will not go into like defining here concepts like what came out as different lineages, origins and forms of community philanthropy, women's philanthropy, and feminist philanthropy. This is something that I'm leaving for reading. But I would like to highlight what came out as important connecting points. This is not extensive list, but just like for sparking out thinking and further conversation. First one is already mentioned is orientation on women. So all 3 concepts are for maybe different reasons and in different ways approaching working with and for women. Then second connection would be focus on shifting the power dynamics between those who give resources and those who claim them or even generate them. So figuring out how we approach different power dynamics within our ecosystem and system is of interest for all 3 concepts. And then third point would be alignment with what the Global Fund for Community Foundation is calling ACT framework, so assets, capacities, and trust. So even though some of these concepts might not necessarily name them in that way or have not even been thinking in these categories, what came out from conversation is that ACT framework is very relevant for literally all actors. Then fourth connecting points would be approach to knowledge. So what is considered to be knowledge? how we generate it, how we collectively make sense of our work, of our world, of everything that we are embedded into. It is very interesting, and this shared urge to change the approach, to go beyond rigid, traditional, patriarchal categories and figure out something that is actually more closer to reality. And finally, I would say important connecting points is work on healing, on repairing harm, both that has been produced by different systems of oppression, but also harm that we might have been unintentionally inflicting on others and ourselves, reclaiming our rights and caring for us and for our communities. So I would originally stop here. I just want to summarize some things that popped up in this morning conversation so that we can see if they resonate with current group of people or you have different dimensions that you want to focus. My impression is that being in community and communicating with each other helps us in in making sense of our work and how it relates to a broader system, but also having space for addressing contested aspects of our work. Because, for example, we have been discussing different conversations around community and how we approach it and how we understand it. And we figured out that it is important not to romanticize either community, either us or movement, because all of these are messy places and it is okay that they are messy. Otherwise, we should question ourselves if we all think the same and do the same. So I think it is what came up is that it is very, very important, and several people underlined that, to have this space where we can be free to openly discuss all these things that usually feel uncomfortable. Like, am I going to be judged if I share that I have some challenges within community? Am I going to judge if I'm not feminist enough or good enough in any other way? So we also came to the conclusion that it's never going to be perfect and it's never going to be enough. And it is also okay because things are evolving, and it also signals that it is a dynamic field and we are not rigid structures. But there are also important points being raised that we need to be aware of our histories, and there is a lot of historical revisionism. And for example, for us coming from Balkans, we've been put in some framework that completely neglect our histories, where literally some of our countries have been built through what we now call community philanthropy, built through self-contribution, volunteering, self-organizing, but it's not recognized and valued and such, and it's being forget. And sometimes we try to reinvent wheel and trying to be something that we are not, while not tapping into what we already have. So acknowledging our histories, acknowledging our achievements, but also how ambivalent they might be, is very important. And then one thing that pop up is figuring out what is our shared interest, because we underlined intention of this was never to say that we are all the same and community philanthropy, feminist philanthropy, and women philanthropy are same thing. They are not. They're quite different. They are unique. A lot of work has been done in building up that profile and explaining to the larger world what each of these concepts means. And even though it does not mean one specific thing, it is a spectrum. And on that spectrum, there are like different positionalities, and it is very important to name them properly. However, what is also important is to figure out that there are shared interests, particularly in this historical moment when the broader philanthropic field has been reconfiguring itself, and most progressive funders, not all of them, but many of them, are withdrawing or changing their approaches, their politics, and so on. So there are many reasons for us to look at each other and figure out, okay, what I'm working is complementary to something that somebody is working in India or wherever, and how we can support each other. So that is one thing that we wanted to emphasize this morning. And another is to also figure out how we can understand like different, how to say it, our different trajectories, different privileges that have, different maneuvering spaces that have or do not have, how space might be shrinking differently for all these concepts. But again, not being stuck in silo, rather figuring out how we can cross-pollinate our ideas and work and figure out like where these connecting dots and how they speak to each other. So I will pause here and open space for others to share, and also want to thank the people who were my interlocutors for sharing not just their knowledge and wisdom, but also their energy. And it really spoke like on soul level. It was very inspiring. So I hope that you will get a glimpse of that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marija. That's just beautifully kind of wrapping it all together. And we were reflecting on the earlier call today that actually a lot of the issues that you name in the report around measurement, about care and healing, about conversations around power, when you started this work, they were less prevalent than they have become subsequently. And I think about how measuring what matters, the summit had a big emphasis on collective care, and so it's sort of also like the field is moving into these spaces because there are big issues that we need to solve ourselves. We're going to hear from a few people who've accepted our invitation to comment on the report. We're going to kick off with Buki Williams. Buki is with Akina Mama Afrika. She's Nigerian but based in Uganda, and has been in the most recent cohort of, or the second cohort of Shift the Power Fellows. So Buki, can I pass to you for your thoughts and reflections and how this resonates with the work that you do?
Yes, good evening, everyone. I would turn my video on, but I feel like it's very distracting because it's gotten dark and I don't have electricity. So you just have to manage with my voice. All right. Thanks again for the report. And as you were saying that this is an important time in terms of what's happening. So for example, the Dutch just released their policy statement yesterday about the new framework that they're going to be operating in. And there was a couple of things as I had read, your reporting preparation for this, and was also reading that policy statement. And it was very interesting the ways in which they were talking about the need for civil society to be sustainable. And that what they were doing under this new strategy that they're putting forward and the new policies to encourage sustainability, because, civil society should not be relying on the government and all of those things. And I thought it was very interesting because the reasons why we have community philanthropy and feminist philanthropy is because the state, doesn't fulfill its role. And this narrative that they have, that they are the ones supporting civil society and that civil society is becoming independent, I find that so interesting, right? Because that is also very true for a subset of people. That is often not true for some of the communities that we work with, right? In many ways, we keep getting reminded by the world. We're seeing that with the elections that have been coming up. We're seeing it with the donors who are closing. We're seeing it with the context that is constantly shifting, that we're the only ones who can save ourselves. And that report really shows that we are the ones who show up for ourselves. And for the longest time, one of the things we always used to say as communities was that when you come and when you leave, the communities is what remains. Either the feminists who are mobilizing, who are trying to shift their own communities and who are bringing in together resources from wherever they can find it. And they use, money and resources in ways to be able to ensure that even if it's small, it still has reach, that it can still be transformative. And it was really good to see that being captured and to see the overlap and the cross-pollination, right? Because we don't feminist alone. We feminist also in communities, and our indigeneity doesn't exist alone, as you say, in terms of the positionalities, but it all exists in that. But and I think what we are hearing, maybe as you're talking about the cosmic, is that we are the ones who who show up for ourselves. And we need to recognize that, and we need to know how to put resources behind that. And to be very strong on that is one thing that I think is very important. I think another thing that also comes up in terms of the cross-pollination that's happening within philanthropy, in terms of community, in terms of, you know, the funds and things like that. But I think we should also, and I loved seeing it in the report, but it also made me concerned, because what we're seeing is the ways in which it is being co-opted and being used against us, you know, in terms of talking about the ways in which we fund, the ways in which we try to resource, in the ways in which I work for a civil society organization, and even the ways we try to share the resources that we do have, right? Because we get, and even though that might be considered also sub-granting or things like that, but for us, our mindset is that what we have, we need to share it with those around us. And we need to use it to support the work, no matter how little it is, no matter how small it is, to just really to be able to invest in the communities who in their name we go out and say we do the work that we do. But we're seeing that the co-optation of that, because when we come in and say like, look, you should be able to fund organizations that are working on the ground directly, that these organizations already have capacity, that they can be trusted, right? That yes, even though we have material needs, we still can be trusted. And we're good custodians of resources. And believe us when we say that. But often we're not trusted, right? We've had to create that trust amongst ourselves and things like that. And in many ways, you're seeing the ways in which it is being talked about that, oh yeah, decolonization means that we shouldn't give you resources. Decolonization means we shouldn't, you know, you go do your own thing. You see how you're going to be fine by yourself, shifting the conversations away from advocacy to now going back to service delivery, right? Because that's where more impact is. As if we ever really differentiate that in the work that we do, because we must provide services as we are advocating, right? Because we must protect the communities that we work with. So I thought, you know, it's great that those kind of things are coming up in terms of the work that we do. And really just to wrap up, I thought that it was so important when we were talking about healing and collective care. And of course, this was something that Magda, Jane, and I, you know, talked about in the summit, but also it's just something that we, and even within the organization I'm in, have carried, you know, to be said, like, we need to find ways to really ensure that is a critical part of our work. Because I think we forget often that a lot of us come to this work when we're already hurt, when we're already traumatized, when we're already dealing with this very systemic atrocities and the way the world reacts, even what we're seeing with Gaza and what we're seeing with Sudan and what we're seeing with Congo and in Cameroon, is just a constant reminder of who matters. And that like the chaos behind that, to be like, you're doing this work, but when it really comes to what matters, people are kind of like, we can't discuss that right now. Or yes, we acknowledge it, but there's not much we can do. Our hands are tied, right? And there's so much heartbreak within that, and so much hurt and so much pain that we're carrying around, that it becomes very difficult to carve out space for that in our work and to see it as important and to not tokenize it. Not because, you know, we don't think it's important, but because it's quite difficult to do, right? In response to kind of like the systemic horrors that we're living with, that we're faced with across the globe, or, you know, in the families and in the homes that we live in as well, and where we see it often. So I thought, you know, that conversation around collective care and healing and the need to care for each other and how we do that and how critical and how important it is, I thought it was important to keep talking about it and to see the ways in which it's centered in feminist philanthropy, in community philanthropy. Because until we continue to ensure that it is understood and it is needed, and that contributes to the material needs of the communities that we work in, you know, it's not going to go further than that. But I thought that was so critical and so important. And so let me stop there, because I could talk forever, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Buki. That's a great contribution. I like the fact that you sort of layered on, the fact that this is about helping, supporting people to claim their rights of government to fulfill their roles, and that extra layer of what is this around? This is about people organizing to express and claim their rights, but also oh, sorry, my cat is slightly obsessed with this meeting. She was on all day this morning as well. If I push her off, she comes back. Forgive me. I love also what we don't feminist alone. Marija had a top line this morning, which let's not be jerks was the other one. But I think if we're looking for some headlines here, but I think this sort of last point around carving out space and time and for care and reflection, and what really strikes me about this report whenever I read it is actually how little time we have to really go and do the deep critical thinking that needs to happen. So often we come together opportunistically or perhaps cynically using silos and categories that fit with what is out there rather than kind of looking inwards. So I really appreciate those extra layers that you added there. We're going to hear now from, and also welcome, thank you. We're going to hear now from Carmen, who joins us from FASOL in Mexico, Fondo Accion Solidaria, a socio-environmental fund, but has done a lot of work around women's rights and the intersections between climate justice and gender justice. So Carmen is going to speak in Spanish. So if you need to use the translation function, go to the little globe along the bottom of the screen and click on English, and then we will hear Carmen. Over to you, Carmen.
Muchas gracias. Pues primero decir que informe tan interesante, tan profundo y tan necesario. Como dice Jenny, FASOL es un fondo socioambiental, estamos en México y desde el nacimiento de FASOL nuestro interés fue colaborar con las bases en los territorios para que las soluciones hacia la justicia climática pudiera nacer desde ahí, ¿no? Y pudiéramos entonces colaborar con esas bases desde el financiamiento y luego, claro, sumando otros recursos que no solamente son los financieros, que es una de las cosas importantes. Entonces, nos fue muy sencillo adherirnos al concepto inicial de filantropía comunitaria. Filantropía comunitaria para nosotras siempre ha hecho sentido desde que FASOL nace. Y ahí nos hemos encontrado con un mundo muy importante de instituciones que se mueven en ese mismo concepto. Como dicen, esto no es un pensamiento que vaya en crecimiento, que sea lineal, sino que van siendo momentos y puntos de encuentro lo que nos provoca hacia otros conceptos. Y en esos momentos y puntos de encuentro nos hemos encontrado con fundaciones, fondos de mujeres que nos han denotado la importancia de voltear a ver cómo es la inversión con las mujeres, hacia las mujeres y desde las mujeres. Y eso nos ha llevado a otro montón de conceptualizaciones y de entendimientos y de pensamientos que también ha permeado hacia FASOL y hacia cómo acercarnos a la justicia socioambiental con una mirada desde las mujeres. Y el otro momento muy importante es cuando tenemos un acercamiento con los fondos feministas, ¿no? Y sí creemos que ahí aprendemos también una nueva forma de hacerlo. Entonces, al final se queda grabado en nuestro ADN estos tres conceptos y aunque siempre nos sentimos más adheridas a la filantropía comunitaria, estamos en ires y venires con lo demás. Los fondos feministas lo que nos enseñaron también fue hacer una reflexión hacia el interior y que pasaba por cada una de las personas que colaboramos en FASOL sobre cuál es nuestro feminismo, cómo lo ejercemos y cómo lo vivimos. Y desde ahí poderlo llevar desde un área muy personal, muy personal y muy compartida con las compañeras en el equipo, cómo podíamos trabajar con esta mirada y con este enfoque en la cotidianidad. Otra cosa muy importante para nosotras ha sido una red que se consolida en México que se llama Arrecife. Arrecife es una red que conjunta a FASOL como un fondo socioambiental o un fondo feminista que es el Fondo Semillas en México, a varias fundaciones comunitarias y una red de fundaciones comunitarias que es Comunalia, que aquí está Minerva, por ahí la veo, y una fundación empresarial. Y todas estas, con una diversidad de pensamientos, teníamos que descifrar cómo hacíamos una filantropía más justa, una filantropía en el marco de derechos y una filantropía que pusiera en el centro a las comunidades y que pusiera en el centro a los activistas. Y cada una ha tenido un aporte distinto. Desde tener que desarrollar el mismo concepto de desarrollo de base y de desarrollo comunitario y sentarnos específicamente a decir qué significa esto, qué significa filantropía comunitaria, qué significa el mismo shift de power y cómo en una traducción puede perder mucho. Para nosotros el shift de power cambia mucho cuando lo ponemos en español y tenemos que encontrar otra forma de concebirlo desde nuestro idioma, desde lo que nosotras hablamos. En esta misma red hemos tenido la oportunidad de llevar estas reflexiones a los grupos comunitarios y a los grupos en el territorio. Y cuando llegamos con los grupos en territorio a hablar sobre filantropía comunitaria, la reacción clásica es, nosotros no queremos saber de eso porque filantropía ya nos representa un capital que nos oprime, un capital que es extractivista y que no nos reconoce. Y ellos no se reconocen dentro de la filantropía comunitaria. Los grupos y las bases sociales no necesariamente se reconocen con ninguno de estos conceptos, ni siquiera con filantropía feminista, mucho menos con el feminismo muchas veces, ¿no? Entonces, creemos que el haber estado en estas mesas de diálogo cada vez más nos abre un paraguas, una serie de conceptos paraguas que nos permiten entonces dialogar y construir conceptos nuestros, apropiados y que hagan sentido desde nosotras para sacarlos también al mundo. Y entonces vemos una importancia en generar conocimiento, pero también generar conceptos estratégicos y clave para poder realmente alcanzar este trabajo sistémico, porque ese es otro de los grandes valores de esta forma de hacer filantropía, que estamos viendo a cada uno de los actores, a los grupos de base, a las fundaciones comunitarias, a las fundaciones que están en medio del norte global y del sur global y que podemos trabajar todos juntos hacia un mismo objetivo, pero solo dentro de estos grandes conceptos. Entonces, estos momentos que nos podemos dar y que son la verdad un lujo para la reflexión sobre cada uno de los conceptos, qué significa y qué significa en cada una de nuestras regiones, es muy importante. Y bueno, solo quiero cerrar pensando en que uno de los grandes aportes de estos tres enfoques tiene que ver con el reconocimiento de los recursos más allá de los financieros. Y eso es una cosa que ha sido una lucha constante hacia nosotras mismas y hacia el exterior y hacia otras formas de financiamiento. No es solo el recurso financiero lo importante, están todos estos otros recursos que no son tangibles, algunos que no son cuantificables, que no tienen un precio económico como la organización comunitaria o como los mismos bienes naturales. Entonces, solo quisiera dejar eso sobre la mesa y me quedo por aquí. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Carmen. I love the way you sort of, without knowing it, you've built on things that started off in this morning's call. So one of our colleagues this morning who works with an environmental organization in India, the Keystone Foundation, she was talking about the fluidity of concepts and how engaging with organizations working around women's rights, feminist rights, the importance of making more expansive meanings and identities in the system. And I love the way your mention of Arrecife, which is a network in Mexico, which is actually modeling this idea that it's not the what you are, it's the values and the world that you want. And so normally in philanthropy, our networks are defined by very limited categories. You're a corporate foundation, you go here. You're a feminist fund, you go here. And Arrecife is a deliberate attempt to weave across the diversity of the Mexican ecosystem and to create, I love this idea of umbrella concepts. So when you put the umbrella, what does it mean for all of those different actors under that umbrella? It will look different. And I think you sort of built on a bit what Buki had mentioned, that this idea around care and reflection and how rare it is when one is busily working, under-resourced, not recognized, how rare it is to have the luxury of time to reflect, and how we really sit on so many abundant resources, but we rarely get a chance to unlock them and put those resources on the table and organize from that basis. So I really appreciate the angle that you introduced there. So thank you so much, Carmen. So now we're going to travel back to Uganda, to Kampala, and we're going to hear a word from Lorna, who works with CivSource, which has done a lot of very interesting work looking at local philanthropy in Uganda. They have some wonderful reports that were published during COVID, which pointed to the essential role that local resources played during COVID-19. Lorna, over to you. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm starting my timer because I also talk too much and I don't want to hog up the space for everyone else. And so I'd just like to appreciate the speakers that have gone before me and shared their insights. I agree with most of the things that have been shared, all the things that have been shared, and also reading the report as someone that does work within philanthropy and applying a feminist lens to philanthropy. It was very interesting, but then I think I took the pessimistic route, and I loved that the report kind of jolted me out of the pessimism. So what I was seeing with the tripartite classification of community philanthropy, women's philanthropy, and feminist philanthropy is that we do a community philanthropy in terms of working with community foundations, doing local resource mobilization, like you said, but we also do feminist philanthropy where we are interrogating the question of how to absorb dirty money from violent systems of capitalism as a means of reparations, but also working with predominantly women's organizations. And so for me, I had always seen them as separate, but then this report kind of got me to see the intersectionality of that. But while I was musing, so I wrote down some musings that I had, and I think the first one that jumped at me was a lot of the things that were coming up in terms of healing justice, in terms of collective care, in terms of how feminists, the things that feminists are doing, the things that feminist funders are doing differently to shift power to communities, are sort of practices that are rooted in indigenous beings, right? So just carrying these practices and then bringing them into philanthropy. But I think a part of the report that then stood out for me was on what we define philanthropy to be. And when I was looking at it like this, in terms of institutional philanthropy, it's built on capitalism, right? It's built on accumulation, and then after you have accumulated all that you can accumulate, to give a very small portion of that to communities and then expect them to change everything, to change their lives within a small period. But then feminist philanthropy comes in and acknowledges this and then tries to use its position and power in the philanthropic ecosystem to question where this money is and then to redirect it to critical resources, to most recognized and undervalued communities. And that's why you have statistics like 1% of the international development aid going to women's rights, feminist organizations, but also queer movements, because they are not fancy to fund in that sense. But as I think Buki said prior, is that communities, women, because women exist at the margins and have been organizing from the margins for a very long time, as marginalized groups, they have come up with ways to survive in the system. I think last week I attended a seminar where they were talking about the rape of men by women. And so I was very interested to see how men are going to organize around sexual gender-based violence. And when I got there, the organization, the way that the men were trying to organize was to pick from what women have done for centuries. And so this is something that is very important to me. When you have lived on the margins for a long time, when you have been a marginalized community for a long time, you do not wait. Like Buki said, you have states that are not less than functional, undemocratic. There's no rule of law. There's no constitutionalism in these countries. And so you have to sort of fend for yourself, and you cannot wait for external sources. And that's where you have things like local resource mobilization, because your revolution and your freedom is not going to come from outside. And so for me, another musing that then stepped out was when I was going through the lessons, I think, and we spoke about feminist, male, participatory grant making, and such of these things that progressive donors have taken on. For me, is to say, when we carry this language, I don't know if it's a cooptation, but like when we carry this language and then slap it on something traditional, something that has been harming the communities, then we say we are going to try and remedy it in this sort of way. So if I get the M&E framework, male framework, and then I slap feminists at the beginning and say, you know, instead of sending me a 50-page report, why do you not send me maybe a video dancing, right? I have limited the damage, but it's still within that very limiting structure, but also a very harmful structure to communities. And so I was thinking, if we're trying to redefine philanthropy, but the way that we've known philanthropy traditionally, especially institutional philanthropy, is that it's been historically harmful to communities, but then we're trying to remedy the harm the best way we can, right? And every time I come to this, I remember Frida, the feminist, the Young Feminist Fund's statement on money being political, and them saying, and them receiving money from Mackenzie's court, whose wealth was again built from Amazon. Is it Amazon? Yes. And we know the labor practices of Amazon and how Amazon was built on the backs of cheap labor, right? And then a feminist organization coming in to take this money and say, look, we acknowledge that this money was made in this sort of way, but we are coming in to give it a reparative approach and trying to redistribute wealth and shift resources back to the hands of the community. And so for me, it always feels like a temporary move. In that sense, I do not know if we can, and that's why I say my timer has gone off, so I'm going to wind up. And that's why I say that I am not sure feminism and philanthropy can, for instance, exist in the same statement. But also what comes out for me is what does collective care look like in a capitalistic society, in a society that does not protect you? You have no social protection. It's based on individualism, right? And we are trying to incorporate collective care and look after self and look after others. But also, you need to survive because that's how the system is set up. And so these are some of the things that were sort of jumping up at me. I couldn't find like a nice, neat golden thread to like tie it with, but I feel like the report then helped in the sense that it kind of acknowledges that we live and work in continued struggle in the world, right? The funding ecosystem that changes erratically, but that the world has not yet reached the place where we can operate with our radical principles, where we actually share and shift the power. For now, there's still an imbalance, and I just want to thank Marija for bringing this out. So thank you.
Thank you so much. You offered your musings as if they were just sort of little ideas. They were all very big, profound ideas, and so I really appreciate those, Lorna. I think this question of, can we operate in the current system? Can you make bad money good, essentially? Are we using philanthropy as it has come to represent, which is resources made from surpluses reinvested back in for perhaps whatever kinds of social returns or not? Or can we claim back that notion of philanthropy as love of humankind, of Ubuntu? My existence is bound up in your existence, like this sort of, actually, that, the extent to which the organizing and reclaiming is about a narrative shift in which these things don't appear in contradiction with each other. So I really appreciate the many provocations that you offered here, but I think also that the way you offered them in the spirit of actually, these are conversations we need to have. They're none of them unsurmountable. And there are indeed forces pushing against many of these ideas at the moment. We've just seen in the election in the United States that people have been somehow, or populist being voted in around the world, that people somehow believe they only have control. They have no agency except to look out for themselves. So that erosion of community, of connectedness, of your well-being is bound up with my well-being, I think is something we can look at as a particular force that many of us are reckoning with who are working in these spaces. So finally, we're going to hear from Florencia, who's joining us from Argentina, from AS. And for those of you at the summit, you may remember that AS put on a lovely event during the summit, which was the awards of the Generosas Prize of Grassroots Women Philanthropy. And I think it was one of the real heartwarming moments of the summit, which just showed other ways are possible and they are happening, and this is what they look like. So maybe we could hear a few reflections from you, Florencia. I think you're going to speak in Spanish, so make sure you've got the translation on, and then we will open it up for further discussion amongst all of us. Florencia.
Bueno, gracias. Buenos días a todos. Gracias por la invitación, gracias por el paper. Quería realmente agradecer haber puesto el paper. Me generó muchas reflexiones y me parece que eso es lo más interesante que puede generar un paper, ¿no? Jenny me pidió que fuera muy cortita, así que voy a tratar de ser lo más breve posible. Yo pensaba que los tres tipos de filantropía que aparecen en la filantropía de mujeres, la filantropía feminista, la filantropía comunitaria, son construcciones externas a la realidad, ¿no? Me parece que eso es importante. Son categorías que nosotros desde afuera tratamos de usar como si fueran anteojos para ver lo que pasa en la realidad, ¿no? Esa es nuestra experiencia desde ellas y desde nuestro trabajo en toda América Latina, y vemos cómo se superponen unas con otras, cómo compiten, ¿no? Cómo se aplastan. Hay todo un juego de roles entre los distintos criterios que básicamente son utilizados o por la cooperación internacional o para las organizaciones intermediarias, pero cuando uno va a la realidad y trabaja en el territorio, eso no existe, ¿sí? Realmente no existe. Nuestra experiencia es que cuando nosotros trabajamos con las organizaciones, como decía recién Jenny, cuando nosotros hacemos trabajos en el territorio, la gente dice, bueno, yo hago lo que puedo, yo me organizo con otras mujeres para dar respuestas colectivas a este problema o a otro tema o a estos y estos. Yo no sé ni cómo se llama ni me importa cómo se llama. Nosotros tenemos conversaciones horizontales, transparentes, para ver cómo nos cuidamos entre nosotros, cómo nos protegemos y cómo en ese proceso encontramos la sobrevivencia y encontramos una manera de vivir que tenga que ver con nuestros códigos, con nuestra identidad, con nuestra cultura, con el buen vivir, con nuestro proyecto de identidad cultural, etcétera, etcétera. Entonces, me parece que esta diferenciación entre las conversaciones académicas y de la gente que trabajamos como nosotros en esto, es importante de desarmarla o separarla de lo que realmente pasa en la realidad. Y iba a decir que nosotros en ellas tuvimos, y quería compartir eso, ¿no? Una experiencia, nosotros como organización que existimos hace 10 años, nosotros empezamos con la idea de justamente filantropía, que de hecho nos llamamos Ellas, Mujeres y Filantropía, con esta idea de cómo poder ayudar a las mujeres filántropas de América Latina a integrarse o contribuir, apoyar la agenda de mujeres en América Latina. Y lo que nos encontramos, para hablar rápidamente, es que todas esas mujeres querían volver a replicar lo mismo que pasa un poco con las corporaciones, ¿no? Ellas querían hacer su propia fundación, sus propias iniciativas, y nosotros decíamos, no, pero está lleno de te ayudamos a mapear todo lo que hay y tratar de ver cómo podés contribuir a eso que ya existe desde abajo para arriba, y vos te encontrás tu rol, pero no vuelvas a crear más y más cosas, porque eso genera una inequidad, bueno, todo lo que muchos de todos nosotros sabemos. Y así como pasamos de mujeres y filantropía a tratar de trabajar en temas que tengan que ver con la filantropía feminista, y después al ecofeminismo, que es donde estamos ahora nosotros, digamos, más focalizados, y en este momento estamos desarrollando en conjunto con el Fondo Casa un fondo socioambiental local, estamos trabajando en el desarrollo de eso, digo, como nosotros como organizaciones vamos también intentando escuchar cada vez más y entender qué rol podemos jugar para apoyar lo que ya sucede, ¿no? Porque ahí me reía un poco antes con algo que dijo Jenny, ¿no? Es como que la cooperación internacional nos ganó la batalla cultural, ¿no? Nos hizo creer que ellos tienen un rol y su rol es fundamental para la transformación social. Y no es verdad. Digamos, nosotros el año pasado, ellas hicimos un trabajo de investigación sobre cómo se financia el movimiento de mujeres en América Latina. Y el movimiento se autofinancia. Digamos, por supuesto que hay fundaciones internacionales y nacionales que van acompañando con un porcentaje muy limitado en términos de recursos, en términos amplios de la palabra recursos, ¿no? Casi todo el trabajo es realizado, digamos, por las propias organizaciones de base, y como planteaba antes en el premio Generosas, ¿no? NECMA, de la Organización de Tejedoras de Guatemala, ¿no? Ella no recibe ninguna financiación, ella fue nombrada, bueno, además de que ganó el premio, nosotros sí le dimos una financiación, pero como ganadora del premio, pero digo, todo el trabajo que ellas hacen, y quiero decir esto porque me parece un poco, por más que sea una provocación, no solamente yo estuve mirando un poco algunos comentarios que están en el blog del Summit, muchos lo nombran como un ejemplo al trabajo de NECMA, pero nadie sigue apoyándola. Es decir, yo hablé con ella hace muy poquito, y le digo, ¿y conseguiste a alguien? ¿Hay otras organizaciones que te contactaron contigo, que están participando? No, nadie, salvo vos, salvo ustedes. Entonces yo le dije, qué paradoja, ¿no? Porque sí la ensalzamos, sí la escribimos, sí, ¿no? Entonces también de nuevo un poco este desfasaje que hay entre lo que pasa en el territorio y cómo nosotros acompañamos, porque finalmente me imagino casi todos los actores que estamos acá somos eso, ¿no? Somos acompañadores, ¿no? Tratar de acompañar eso que ya sucede, ¿no? Quizá el mejor ejemplo en América Latina, yo siempre hablo de donde trabajo, fue el tema del COVID, ¿no? Ni el Estado, ni las empresas, ni las fundaciones, fueron la gente que se organizó de manera comunitaria para poder dar respuestas a un problema que, bueno, excedía a todo el mundo, pero bueno, finalmente los únicos que hicieron cosas concretas fueron las organizaciones y las comunidades, ¿no? Y quería también decir que, por ejemplo, nosotros en ellas, un poco en broma, pero un poco en serio, nosotros somos víctimas, como ellas, de esa propia categorización ficticia de la realidad, porque entonces la gente nos dice, ¿pero ustedes son un fondo? No. Pero si ustedes hacen regranting, sí, pero lo hacemos en función de a determinados momentos. Entonces pero hacen investigación, así que son academia. No, pero como venimos de la academia, podemos hacer esto también, y cuando hacemos solamente cuando hay algo que no entendemos y queremos entender de qué se trata. Entonces, pero todos nos quieren, hacen community philanthropy. No, pero nosotros solamente trabajamos con organizaciones comunitarias. Y eso mismo, a veces, o en muchas situaciones, nos impide generar alianzas internacionales, porque nos dice, no, nosotros financiamos solamente a los que trabajan haciendo fundaciones comunitarias. Si no sos una fundación comunitaria, salí. No, solamente los que hacen regranting, no sos salí. No, ¿trabajás con mujeres indígenas? Por supuesto, esto es América Latina. Pero no solamente con... No, entonces no. Entonces digo, la realidad es mucho más compleja, ¿no? No simplifiquemos en función de poder tener una conversación o poder generar recursos, terminamos simplificando, ¿no? La realidad, y la realidad es cada vez más compleja. Así que bueno, eso era un poco para contar algunas de estas cosas. Después quería también hacer dos comentarios adicionales. Uno tiene que ver con una de las cosas que plantearon. Como dijo Jenny, yo soy y vivo en Argentina. Nosotros acabamos de elegir un presidente que es como si fuera Trump, pero tercermundista, digamos, ¿no? Que no sabemos si es peor o mejor, pero que es un desastre. En todo sentido, sobre todo en todos los temas que a nosotros nos preocupan, y sobre todo con el tema de derechos. Y es lo mismo que está sucediendo en el mundo. Entonces, una vez más, la batalla antiderechos nos está ganando, la filantropía antiderechos nos lleva kilómetros de distancia, moviliza miles y millones de dólares de manera totalmente flexible, sin tener que decir quién sos ni cómo, en los medios, en el sector público, en el sector privado, digamos, en todos los aspectos de la... y me parece que eso es lo que uno debería estar tratando de entender, cómo le vamos a dar batalla a esto que nos viene encima, y nosotros estamos tratando. Quiero contar una anécdota. El otro día estaba en París en una reunión de fundaciones, y la conversación giraba alrededor de que habían logrado reducir el formulario que antes tenía 100 preguntas a 50. Entonces, para los grantees era mucho más fácil poder responder. Y yo tenía ganas de decir, gente, dedíquense a otra cosa. Eso no puede ser, ¿no?, la discusión, digamos. Quiero decir, ilustrar un poco cómo el liberalismo y la destrucción de la tierra y de los derechos de la tierra nos está pasando por encima, y bueno, y uno está perdido, algunas organizaciones siguen perdidas en eso. Y la buena noticia es que nosotros estamos con un grupo de organizaciones en América Latina abriendo conversaciones sobre cómo construir un movimiento latinoamericano. Y me parece que eso es una muy buena noticia, porque una de las cosas, bueno, hay una participación muy activa de casi todas las organizaciones que forman parte del movimiento Shift the Power. Muchas organizaciones nos dijeron, nos ayudan a hacer uno con otros que no forman parte, y nosotros dijimos sí. Así que la conversación se va expandiendo, es totalmente horizontal. La confianza es el elemento básico, y un concepto que es la generosidad, que a mí me parece que es un valor muy importante, que si uno lo piensa desde una perspectiva política, es una pelea contra el capitalismo, ¿no? Contra la competencia, contra el individualismo, contra yo me llevo esto y a vos te dejo sin nada, ¿no? Entonces, cuando uno habla de solidaridad y construir una cultura solidaria entre todas las organizaciones que formamos parte de un mismo movimiento, hubo muchísimo eco, ¿no? Y muchísima participación. Y me parece que eso, no sé, es un espacio de esperanza, ¿no? Pero de esperanza en función de la construcción que se necesita realizar, sigo hablando de América Latina, respecto a este tsunami de la ultraderecha a la cual yo personalmente estoy aterrorizada, digamos, ¿no? Y pienso que sí tenemos los soportes para dar respuestas, pero hay que flexibilizarlos, hay que agilizarlos, hay un montón de trabajo para entender cómo trabajar como un movimiento, ¿no? Bueno, prometí que iba a ser corta y me parece que no fui tan corta, perdón.
Muted. Wonderful. It was just right, Florencia. Thank you so much. And I think, you know, just hearing you speak, going back to what Buki had said around sharing this idea of generosity. I mean, I feel like we've got two momentums. One is around sort of flow, fluidity, expansiveness, creating new spaces, generosity, sharing. We need a new space to have this conversation in which to organize, as well as having that kind of political dimension of what it is we're organizing against, that this is not a neutral space. There are forces organizing better and more intentionally without asking 100 questions or even 50 questions, right? And so we need to be operating in those realities. And I think the other point you were saying around what one of our colleagues in Indonesia talks around, the idea of making meaning, not imposing terms, that action, what exists on the ground that can be elevated, language can be used to help communicate that rather than to say, oh, good news, you've been doing this all along and I'm telling you that you belong to this tribe, right? Your community philanthropy, you're this. And so I think that you brought us to a wonderful place for us to spend the next few minutes discussing as a group. And I can see a lot of people on this call are involved in different parts of this conversation. So I'd love to hear from others who'd like to contribute. Shuba, I can see you're there. And I did hope that maybe the email I sent you yesterday about something else would suggest that I might invite you to speak, but we'd love to hear from you joining us from India.
Thank you so much. I just will kick off with the last point you made, which was on the language, because that is something that I think for us, we struggled also to define who we were, because one of the words that was used was that we were an intermediary organization, and we kept feeling that that doesn't define us, because and so the language of community foundations, we picked it up because it resonated with what we were doing. It was not the other way around. So it was empowering for us to find words that helped. And I wanted to also thank the other speakers, because there's so much here that resonates with what the small research that we did, which looked at what is the non-project kind of support that organizations value. And it went back to the ACT framework, which all of you have developed, and people spoke about trust, people spoke about a relationship, and money came much later down on that list. So just wanted to flag those two things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shuba. Anyone else want to chip in at this point? Hugh, go for it.
Yes, thank you very much. I think those were very inspiring talks by all of you, and I've learned a tremendous amount from what you had to say. And I totally agree with the last speaker, Florencia, I think, was it? Yeah. You're absolutely right on. And I really begin to wonder, about the theories of change, because I was trained by the Rockefeller Foundation a long time ago, and we spent a lot of time developing our theories of change. I suspect the theory of change concept is rather colonial, because there you have people, economists and experts and so on, sitting in Zurich or London or New York, working out a theory of change without talking to the people who they're trying to help. And that's upside down. What they should be doing is going out to the countries or places they want to help and saying, what are your greatest needs and how can we help you, and tell us what you need. And so the whole thing seems to be upside down, and I think really the theory of change is something that we can do without.
Thank you very much, Hugh. I think many on this call would be up for that. Other thoughts, and anyone, any of the others who've already spoken, reflecting on what others have said. But this is our time, and I just want to say, look, it is rare that we have these opportunities to have this conversation. I think this conversation is so rich. If we have what we need to do the thing we need to do, it's just how do we now move this conversation forward? What would help build this bigger space to start weaving this different kind of a narrative? Because each of the speakers so far has pointed to different dimensions of it in ways that we have so much we could be doing together. So anyone else want to share with any further reflections? And Marija, I hope you're wanting to come back in at some point before we close off too.
I can share later final reflections, but I was hoping that more people will claim the space. So yeah, please jump in.
Maria's asking, please jump in. I guess I'll have to name you, Andres, Catherine. I can see you there. Eshban, you were on the earlier call. Rosario. Andres, go for it.
I'll jump in Spanish preferably, but otherwise I can speak English. Creo que un punto importante del report que me gustó mucho y que es breve, leí el summary, no leí el full report, en los takeaways, que es acerca de monitoring, evaluation and learning, y que lo junto con el comentario de Hugh Davidson acerca de la teoría de cambio, y que lo junto con la gran moda actual de evaluar y mirar los metrics y el impacto y impact, y todo el mundo está hablando de impact ahora. Y creo que lo que un poco surge del report es, por lo menos a mí me incita a pensar que gran parte de nuestra tarea, estos movimientos, tanto el movimiento, las corrientes que trabajan con filantropía comunitaria, con filantropía feminista, filantropía de mujeres, eh, están un poco alejados de esa discusión. Creo que ha habido una penetración muy fuerte, muy grande de una mirada tecnocrática, empresarial, eh, eh, científica, entre comillas, sobre qué es lo que hacemos. Y creo que hay una cierta distorsión en este momento de que nos estamos corriendo a responder a esas demandas que son, como decía Hugh, son demandas nuevamente colonialistas de tomar conceptos y tomar formas de trabajo que no son las tradicionales, por lo menos en la región de América Latina, pero que para efectos de financiación hay que responder a esas demandas, no solo a las 50 preguntas, sino al impacto, hay que presentar los metrics, etc. Yo el otro día estaba eh, intentando completar un formulario para solicitar un financiamiento a una fundación francesa, L'Oréal específicamente, y desistí y tengo 50 años de experiencia de escribir proyectos, pero en este caso desistí a los 5 minutos cuando empecé a ver las preguntas que hacían, me resultaban tan extemporáneas para esta realidad que dije, bueno, esta gente está hablando de un modelo de trabajo de hace 50 años atrás. Yo trabajé en una gran organización financiadora también, donde hace 20 años atrás o 25 años atrás hacíamos un esfuerzo para simplificar todo esto. Pero me da la sensación de que no se simplifica, que se complejiza cada vez más y que se incorpora eh, un lenguaje y una mirada al mundo excesivamente tecnocrática. Entonces me parece que en estos espacios, que son espacios de mayor libertad, los que tenemos, y de mayor reflexión en profundidad, deberíamos prestar un poco más de atención a dar respuestas frente a esto, ¿no? Y cierro con esto nuevamente eh, cuando nosotros hicimos el premio Generosas en ellas, fue con la idea de encontrar un eje transversal a lo que hacía mucha gente, que era tanto trabajadoras sexuales en Argentina, como ecologistas en México, como feministas, etcétera. Y es muy difícil medir la generosidad. Están los ejemplos, están las conversaciones, están las personas, pero si nos piden medir el impacto de la generosidad, hay que bailar mucho, ¿no? Gracias.
Thanks, Andres. And I, that I think I could see everyone nodding, even if their cameras were off, I could feel them nodding about recognizing that experience of trying to fill in forms. It's like sometimes our work feels like this beautiful fabric with many colors, and then we come to fill in a form and we have to cut off a piece to answer that question and cut off another piece to answer that question. And none of the pieces look like the thing that we are along the way. And that actually, talking about care and exhaustion and stuff, often we just feel like we're failing. We're failing to access resources because we're not fitting into the categories when the questions are the wrong ones in the first place, and how we shift some of the dynamics around that. I can see that a little team there has just put their camera on. Terasai, Eshban, do you want to say something?
Hi, everyone. I mean, I think we're in agreement with a lot that was said. I think that particularly the point around theories of change was really resonant to us, that we might need to rethink our metrics of kind of thinking about the impacts that these movements have made so that we don't miss all the good that has happened. And yeah, just so we're evaluating in a way that's more accurate to the current context.
Yeah. Indeed, the three of us were just following this conversation and generally agreeing that movements don't usually have enough spaces to just learn out loud from each other, and that, there are so many divides between movements, and it would really be nice to just have more learning out loud amongst various movements. Yeah, so that's us.
Thank you. That's the contingent in Zimbabwe joining us today. Wonderful. Any other contributions from anyone before I hand back to Marija to share some final reflections?
So,
you,
very quick one,
you, and then Florencia, and then Marija.
Yes, very quick one. We've had a lot of experience. I'm mainly a funder, but I have spent a lot of time in the field. We've had a lot of success with women's empowerment groups. Groups of maybe 30 women. And in Bangladesh, we had about 200 of these on a program to treble the real income of about 7,000 women and their families. And we had 5 empowerment measures, and we measured it continuously with a panel of about 1/10 of the total universe every 6 or 12 months, and was continuous improvement. A lot of the empowerment groups were local people from local villages and working together, and it worked really well. We failed, I'm afraid, to get it scaled, but it was a good program. I just wondered what the feeling is about these pretty, semi-autonomous women's empowerment groups who, within a framework, have a lot of power to do what they want under a woman leader.
Thanks, Hugh. I imagine a lot of people on this call might not use that framing or language, but are, working with women's groups, grassroots groups, exactly based on those principles. But perhaps that's for a conversation for another time, because I think that is the sort of the organic organizing of a lot of women's rights, grassroots movements. So certainly it resonates, I'm sure. Florencia, we'll hear from you, and then from Buki, and then we'll turn to Marija.
Solo quería decir que en los formularios se esconde el control y el abuso de poder de las fundaciones y de la cooperación internacional hacia las organizaciones que trabajamos en el territorio. Y también en las demandas de evaluación, ¿no? Yo pensaba, como comenté antes, cuando lo escucho pienso, ¿y a vos quién te evalúa? ¿Cuáles son los indicadores de éxito de vos como fundación? ¿A dónde las contás? ¿Dónde las mostrás? ¿Por qué hay esta inequidad en esa conversación en la cual vos deberías estar compartiendo, digamos, somos todos actores del desarrollo donde cada uno tiene su rol, ¿no? Debería, digamos, ¿cómo llegamos, construimos ese ecosistema? Entonces quería decir eso del formulario y la verdad que también quiero decirlo públicamente, aunque lo digo todo el tiempo, que el Global Fund para mí es la excepción de la regla, ¿no? Digo, es un modelo de relación, de intercambio, de conversaciones que yo realmente las quiero felicitar públicamente, primero porque es eso, es cada uno tiene su rol y entre todos tratamos de entender cómo hacer las cosas mejores juntos, que es lo mismo que pasa en el territorio, ¿no? Como decía yo antes, ¿no? Las mujeres se juntan para entender cómo hacer de su lugar un lugar mejor para vivir. Y creo que en ese sentido el Global Fund es un actor genial en esa construcción, ¿no? Y entonces siempre es la pregunta que creo que es el esfuerzo de ustedes de cómo llevar esa mirada y esa manera de trabajar tan horizontal y en confianza, donde nadie controla a nadie, donde todos tratamos de ser mejores en lo que hacemos, cómo llevarla a otros lugares, ¿no? A otros espacios del desarrollo, ¿no? Así que quería, nada, eso quería agradecer, porque es realmente un privilegio trabajar con ustedes. Quiero decirlo out loud.
Oh, thank you. That was very nice, Francia. But I have to say that everything we have learned about how we work is copied from people doing this kind of work on the ground. Like, I think we work in service of those who are building communities from the bottom up. So the beauty of this community is the circularity and the generosity of learning. And I think there's something we could all do better at, is say, we don't do this, we do this. These are the practices. This is the way we think. This is the way we're thinking. And I feel like we have a resource collectively that we don't elevate sufficiently. And it's critical to thinking about, we know if we carry on doing the things the old way, nothing's going to change. So I think within this community, there are huge resources around not just the what, but the how of how we're doing it. I'm going to turn to Buki and then we'll hear from Marija and we'll wrap things up. Buki, over to you.
Yeah, thank you all so much for this food for thought. It was just really also interesting because just the other day I was having a conversation with someone because I opened up another proposal document and I really asked somebody, I was like, do you think that anyone who develops these forms have ever worked in a civil society organization, one where you are the one doing everything, you know? Like, who writes these forms? Like, you know, and these questions, and you think is so smart and so brilliant and is going to capture things. And, you know, it just really goes back to what a lot of people have said, which is the fact that as we are seeing, as many are saying, maybe that this is showing the limits of neoliberalism. We're seeing the limits of these democratic movements. We're just seeing the limits of all of these things we've relied upon. And I think really it is time for us, in terms of this thinking and this reflection that we're doing, that we have to show the alternatives, as has been said. We really have to. I think it's really incumbent in terms of the work that we're doing that we really need to demonstrate the alternatives to these limits, because if not, we are going to keep going down this road where people are just more disillusioned, because what others have managed to do, especially these populist movements, have managed to offer kind of like a way out and an easy way out for people. And I think for us, we really need to be able to showcase why, you know, the things that amaze us in terms of the women's groups, or the things that amaze us in terms of the communities that do this really powerful work, but that comes at the expense of their health, of their sanity. I think we really kind of need to do better in being able to show why what we're talking about matters, and what these alternatives really mean. Because right now, it's needed now more than ever. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Buki. Before I hand over to Marija, I think this is something that we at the Global Fund are really thinking about, is how can we start to provide the spaces? It's the lack of spaces, the lack of surplus time and energy to do this sort of organizing. So I think we'd very much like to continue these kinds of conversations with you all and others. But Marija, let's pass to you. How are you feeling? What are you hearing?
I feel so many things that have been resonating, and I see a lot of potential to connecting them even further. And it speaks like in a way that we need like more conversations how in within which we sit and how we are positioned, and also to manage expectations, like what can be done through philanthropy. Like philanthropy is not revolutionary forces, and as it's already said, it historically does harm, it still does harm, even though it has some potential to support, but like there are limitations. So like first thing for me is always like to move away from linearity and expecting that change goes like A, B, C, D, tra la la. No, it's like mess, it's complete mess. And we need to build this muscle and capacity to be okay with this messiness. And it also goes back to saying like of measurement and tracking ourselves. Like for me, it is always important to acknowledge not just progress and track the progress, rather to figure out how we are holding the ground, like not going behind. It is very important, and it is almost never captured in traditional measurements. So even preserving status quo is extremely important in certain contexts. So this is something that as formal male person, for me was like important angle. And then as it has been mentioned several times, like moving away from this, checking the boxes and opening spaces for spectrum, because I personally have many hats. I myself run pop-up initiative that of course does not fit any box, and sometimes it's academic, it's research, sometimes, I mean, it's always community resource and community organizing, and it is about creating safety nets and mutual support among activists, and it is not any form that you can find on any forum. But then my hat, when I'm sitting in foundation or when I'm a researcher, it's completely different. So I'm trying to figure out how these things speak to each other. So I would say that we need to completely get rid of all prescribed categories and develop a language that is more open, like not develop, but pick up from the ground a language that is rooted into reality, and that speaks about terminology and something that people embrace from their tradition, from their culture, from their spirituality, for something that is like everyday life. But there is also, I think, important thing, and I think we might have like different ideas there, and it also popped up in research. While spectrum is important and while some categories are artificial, it is also important to name things. And I think it is important contribution from feminist movement, like naming issues, naming people, opening space for different marginalized identities. And I just don't want us to go away with the notion that is not important. It is extremely important, and centering people who historically have been neglected and unseen and unheard. It is not me calling for some artificial identity politics. It is figuring out again how are we all interconnected, but also acknowledging different privileges and different positions that we have in the system. So I think it is important to also name different things. But yeah, just to like conclude, I think we need to acknowledge our limitations. And we are functioning within the capitalism, and it was already mentioned, we are taking dirty money and there is no clean money. So it is just dirty in different ways. So I would say that it is important to pay attention to both ways, claiming what has been historically extracted from our communities and now giving back like small crumbles back, but also nurturing what we have and what we can have through generating our own resources, and that those things should not be separate, but should complement each other. So also having this relation to funder community, to the state, to the private sector is important, but also being like there for each other and being each other's safety net, it's simply impossible to go without that. And just like a brief reminder, like while we are talking about building trust with funders, like, and thinking if we are going to take this money or not, funding for right-wingers are massive and unrestricted, and they all collaborate with each other. So we also need to collaborate each other and have unrestricted core flexible funding that allows us to sustain our movements without losing sight what are the things and how are things generated from the grassroots. So having all these multiple layers and dimensions with which we are engaging with is extremely complex, extremely exhausting, and I think it is one more reason why we need to show for each other with care and grace, but also with compassion, and be there not just like to support each other, but to push each other to move forward while acknowledging all these differences and not forgetting where we are coming from and historically how even we among each other might neglect some of the important allies in our ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Marija. These two meetings we've done today about this report have generated just such a wonderful outpouring of warmth and generosity, but also thinking. If you haven't had a chance to click on the the messages that Shuba has put from an Indian funder, they are quite kind of classic. Like if there's one thing we could do, which would be to make this kind of donor practices seem like an embarrassment in the future, this is something we could definitely be working together on. Just sort of ridiculous requirements and sort of arrogance of those who think they have knowledge and is this real book you're saying? Yes. I'm afraid it is. But I just want to really thank everyone. And now Catherine's chipping in. We need to get this conversation out. Yeah, I think that exactly. We do need to get this conversation out there. So for today, let's just see it as a bit of a start. I think we'd like to be able to produce some translations of this report so that it can be circulated more broadly. But I think the report and the conversations we've had today, both of them. So if you get a chance to watch this morning's call, that's interesting too. But I just want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart, because I just love the way that everyone has shown up for this conversation as well. I hope that you will be leaving this call with some feeling of warmth in your belly around, actually, we have much more than sometimes we think we do. We have the people, we have the ideas, we just need to organize ourselves differently. So thank you all so much for joining. I wish you a really good rest of your day. Yeah, still take time to take a screenshot of Shuba's shocking sharings from an Indian funder, just to really, if you want to get kind of animated of a day, read those. and let's conversation. Yeah, and absolutely. I think let's what we really want to do is to come back and start thinking about, so what can we do next? What are some of the next steps that we can do together without kind of further, like working to the processes and the spaces that we have. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Marija, for the sharing, and for everyone else, the contributors and everyone who's joined and sat in on this discussion. Wishing you a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.